Everyone thinks Jun-hee was the innocent pregnant victim, but she might be the most evil player in Squid Game history. So today, I'm breaking down every theory about how her secretly evil behavior destroyed everyone around her, starting with her poor decisions that hurt people. Sometimes the most selfish thing you can do is pretend to be helpless. Jun-hee knew exactly what she was getting into. When Jun-hee entered the Squid Game, she was heavily pregnant and clearly in no condition to compete in deadly physical challenges. Any reasonable person would recognize that pregnancy makes survival nearly impossible in competitive games, but she entered anyway. This wasn't brave or desperate. It was irresponsible on a massive scale. She knew she couldn't protect herself, couldn't run fast, couldn't fight effectively, and couldn't handle the physical demands of competition. Yet she still signed up. From day one, she became a burden that others had to manage. Players like Gi-hun felt morally obligated to protect her because she appeared vulnerable and helpless.
도와주세요. 아이가 있어요.
This forced them into caretaking roles during life or death scenarios where every second of distraction could mean death. The worst part is that she probably knew this would happen. Pregnant women naturally evoke protective instincts, especially from people with decent moral compasses. She used basic human decency against the very people trying to help her, but avoiding responsibility is nothing compared to actively sabotaging the people trying to save you. Trust is everything in survival situations, and she made sure no one could trust anyone. Her personal drama destroyed every group she joined. Alliances are crucial for surviving the Squid Game. Teams provide protection, share resources, and coordinate strategies that individual players can't achieve alone. Jun-hee's presence turned every alliance into a dysfunctional mess riddled with suspicion and conflict. Her complicated relationship with Myung-gi created immediate tension in any group dynamic.
그 몸으로 누가 너 끼워줄 것 같아?
신경 꺼. 내가 알아서 해.
The paternity questions around her baby, their shared history, and her obvious trust issues with him became everyone else's problem to navigate. Instead of dealing with their drama privately, she made it a public issue that affected group decisions. Her inability to communicate clearly about her past or her needs meant that team members never knew what they were really dealing with. Every group she joined experienced breakdowns in communication and cooperation. Her emotional volatility and secretiveness created an atmosphere of suspicion that infected other relationships. Team members started questioning each other's motives and loyalties because they couldn't figure out what was really going on with her. But speaking of destroying teams from within, her emotional manipulation went way deeper than relationship drama. Maybe her breakdowns weren't as innocent as they seemed. Her emotional chaos systematically destroyed hope and morale. Jin-hee's constant emotional instability created a toxic atmosphere that infected everyone around her. While other players were trying to maintain hope and find reasons to keep fighting, her despair and volatility dragged down the entire group's mental state. Her inability to manage her own trauma meant that everyone else had to absorb the emotional fallout.
저기 어디가 어떻게 아픈지 나한테 얘기해봐요. 어?
무서워요.
Instead of processing her feelings privately or finding constructive ways to cope, she made her psychological breakdown a shared experience that poisoned group morale. The persistent tension she created made it nearly impossible for others to maintain the positive mindset necessary for survival. Hope and determination are crucial psychological resources in life or death situations. Her emotional chaos systematically eroded these resources for everyone in her vicinity. The timing of her emotional outbursts was particularly destructive. Just when groups needed to come together and focus on challenges, she would create interpersonal drama that divided attention and energy. It's almost like she had a sixth sense for disrupting group cohesion at the worst possible moments. Whether this was intentional or subconscious doesn't matter. The effect was the same: systematic sabotage of every group dynamic she touched. But emotional manipulation pales next to the strategic way she prevented organized resistance. While others planned escape, she demanded protection. Her constant neediness derailed every attempt at rebellion. The most successful way to survive the Squid Game isn't just to play by the rules, it's to find ways to subvert the system, organize resistance, or coordinate escape attempts. Jun-hee's presence made these strategic approaches nearly impossible for anyone around her. Her constant need for physical and emotional support meant that potential resistance leaders had to divide their attention between two completely different priorities. They couldn't focus on planning rebellion when they were busy managing her immediate survival needs.
이따 불 꺼지면 바로 숨어. 무슨 일 생겨도 절대 나서지 말고.
Players like Gi-hun, who might have spent their mental energy figuring out how to expose or escape the games, instead had to focus on immediate caretaking responsibilities. Every hour spent protecting Jun-hee was an hour not spent on strategic thinking that could have benefited everyone. Her vulnerability also made it impossible for her allies to take the kinds of risks that resistance efforts require. When you're responsible for protecting someone who can't protect themselves, you can't engage in dangerous activities like gathering intelligence, coordinating with other rebels, or attempting escape. But strategic sabotage is nothing compared to the way she systematically corrupted good people's moral principles. Corruption spreads like infection when someone needs constant saving. She turned protectors into people they never wanted to become. Jun-hee's presence created impossible ethical dilemmas that forced good people to compromise their principles in ways they never would have otherwise. By positioning herself as someone who desperately needed protection, she made moral choices that seemed clear-cut but were actually traps.
다들 말 좀 해봐요!
그건 이 사람 말이 맞아요.
Players who tried to help her found themselves making increasingly questionable decisions. They had to choose between saving her and saving others. They had to prioritize her needs over fairness to other vulnerable players. They had to abandon their broader moral principles to focus on one person's survival. The psychological pressure of being responsible for someone else's life in such extreme circumstances broke down the moral frameworks that normally guide behavior. Good people started making choices they would have condemned in others because they felt obligated to keep her alive. Her protectors became resentful, exhausted, and morally compromised. The constant stress of trying to save someone who couldn't save herself eroded their empathy for other players, and their commitment to broader principles of fairness and justice. The worst part was how her vulnerability made it impossible to question these dynamics. Anyone who suggested that protecting her was harming the group or compromising their values could be painted as heartless or selfish. She created a moral trap that punished clear thinking. But destroying others' morals isn't as manipulative as the psychological warfare she used in her final moments. Her final act wasn't sacrifice. It was emotional blackmail. She made her death everyone else's trauma to carry.
아저씨까지 잘못되면 아이도 죽어요.
When Jun-hee chose to end her own life, she didn't just exit the games quietly or peacefully. She made her suicide a manipulative tool that transferred massive psychological burden to the survivors, particularly Gi-hun and other players who had tried to protect her. Her final moments were filled with desperate pleas for others to take care of her newborn daughter. This wasn't just a dying wish, it was a calculated guilt trip that ensured her death would haunt the survivors regardless of what happened next. If they failed to protect her baby, they would live with the knowledge that they had broken a promise to a dying mother. If they succeeded in protecting the child, they would carry the enormous burden of keeping an infant alive in a death game. Either way, she ensured her death would cause maximum psychological damage. The timing of her suicide was particularly manipulative. She chose to die at a moment when others were most emotionally invested in her survival, maximizing the shock and guilt her death would create. It was designed to be as traumatic as possible for the people who cared about her. Her final words weren't just requests, they were commands backed by emotional blackmail. She used her dying breath to impose obligations on others that they would feel morally bound to fulfill, regardless of the personal cost. Speaking of using others for personal gain, this next theory reveals how she manipulated the game's deadliest element. Blood might not be on her hands, but bodies definitely piled up around her. Her vulnerability became other people's death sentence. Jun-hee's apparent helplessness created a magnetic field of death around her that claimed multiple victims who might have survived if they hadn't been distracted by protecting her. The pattern is undeniable once you look at the casualty list. Players like Hyunju and Gyumja died because they prioritized Jun-hee's safety over their own survival instincts.
우리 다 같이 여기서 나갈 수 있어요. 빨리요.
These were capable, intelligent people who made fatal mistakes because they were focused on protecting someone else instead of watching their own backs. Her pregnancy naturally drew protective attention from anyone with basic human decency. This created a deadly dynamic where the most moral players exposed themselves to higher risks, made strategic sacrifices, and diverted resources that could have kept them alive. The most tragic aspect is that many of these deaths were completely preventable. If Jun-hee hadn't been there to distract and drain resources, her protectors would have been free to focus on their own survival and might have lived through challenges that killed them. But accidental deaths are nothing compared to what happens when vulnerability becomes a calculated weapon. Sometimes the most dangerous weapon is looking helpless. She turned compassion into a strategic advantage that got people killed. Jun-hee's pregnancy wasn't just a medical condition. It was the perfect tool for manipulation in an environment where most people had retained some shred of human decency. She understood exactly how her appearance would affect others and used that knowledge ruthlessly. She consistently played up her physical limitations and emotional distress to secure better treatment from allies. When resources were scarce, she got priority. When protection was needed, she got coverage. When difficult decisions had to be made, others absorbed the risk while she stayed safe. The genius of her manipulation was how it disguised selfishness as victimhood. Every time she accepted help or protection, she was essentially stealing survival resources from people who needed them just as much. But because she looked helpless, her resource consumption appeared justified.
할머니, 준희 씨. 저랑 같이 가요.
Her strategy worked because it exploited the psychological blind spots of decent people. Most players retained enough humanity to want to protect pregnant women and children. She weaponized that instinct to turn their compassion into her competitive advantage. But emotional manipulation is child's play compared to the strategic calculation behind her final choice. What if her death wasn't tragedy but strategy? Her suicide was perfectly timed to create maximum psychological warfare. Jun-hee's decision to end her own life wasn't just despair or sacrifice. It was a calculated move designed to create the most psychologically damaging situation possible for the remaining players, particularly those who had invested emotionally in her survival. The timing of her suicide was strategically perfect. She waited until others were maximally invested in her welfare, then removed herself in a way that would create the greatest possible guilt and trauma. If she had died earlier or later, the psychological impact would have been much less severe. Her death also served as a protection mechanism for players like Gi-hun. By removing herself from the game, she prevented them from having to make increasingly difficult choices about prioritizing her survival over others.
56번. 그래 내놔. 그 애새끼 이리 내놔.
But this apparent generosity came with a devastating cost. The real strategic genius was leaving behind her newborn daughter as a living player. This wasn't an accidental consequence of her death. It was the culmination of a plan that turned her baby into the ultimate psychological weapon against the remaining competitors. She knew that her infant would force impossible moral choices on the survivors. They would have to decide whether to harm or neglect an innocent baby or sacrifice their own lives to protect her. This created a moral paradox that no decent person could resolve without severe psychological damage. She essentially used her own death as a strategic move that introduced the cruelest possible element into the remaining games, while positioning herself as a tragic victim rather than the architect of psychological warfare. But strategic suicide is nothing compared to the ultimate manipulation of turning pure innocence into a weapon of mass destruction. She turned the most innocent thing possible into the cruelest weapon. Her baby became the ultimate moral torture device. The most diabolical aspect of Jun-hee's entire strategy was how she used her pregnancy and subsequent death to transform pure innocence into a psychological weapon that would torture every remaining player. This wasn't accidental. It was the logical endpoint of her manipulative approach. By giving birth and then dying, she ensured that her infant daughter would become a contestant in the Squid Game. This created an unprecedented situation where players had to contemplate the ultimate taboo, harming or allowing harm to come to an innocent baby to advance their own survival. Her baby became a living symbol that exposed the darkest aspects of every remaining player's character. Those who prioritized the child's welfare revealed their willingness to sacrifice themselves for innocence. Those who prioritized their own survival revealed their capacity for moral compromise in extreme circumstances. The genius of this manipulation was how it made her the victim while simultaneously making her the architect of the most psychologically devastating test in the entire series. She appeared to be a tragic mother who died protecting her child, while actually being the person who deliberately put that child in mortal danger. Speaking of impossible moral tests, her final legacy reveals the true scope of her psychological warfare. The most evil thing you can do is make good people consider becoming monsters. Jun-hee's arc was deliberately designed to force every remaining player into the most excruciating ethical test imaginable. This wasn't a byproduct of her choices. It was the intended outcome of a carefully constructed psychological manipulation campaign. Her story created a scenario where decent people had to seriously contemplate harming an innocent baby to save their own lives. This is the kind of moral boundary that separates humans from monsters, and she deliberately put people in a position where crossing that boundary became a rational survival choice. The test she created had no good answers. Protecting her baby meant almost certain death for the protector. Harming or neglecting the baby meant becoming the kind of person who prioritizes their own survival over innocent life. Either choice resulted in psychological destruction. But forcing individual choices is nothing compared to her ultimate achievement, destroying the concept of humanity itself. If you enjoyed this video, you need to see what a day in the life is like of Squid Game's most evil character, the frontman. Click the video to find out.